I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I'm running to be the next Rhode Island Attorney General. I've practiced law for the last 16 years, 12 of them in the office of the Attorney General, so I have the knowledge and experience to do that job at a high level. I'm not here to fight for a political agenda. I'm not here to fight for a special interest. I'm here to fight for the rights of every Rhode Islander, no matter where you come from or no matter what your background is. I'll need your votes on September 13th for the primary election and November 8th for the general election. If you have any questions about where to vote or how to vote, please contact your local Board of Canvassers or the Secretary of State's office or website. I'm not running to be just another politician. I'm running to be a public servant who can serve as a much-needed check and balance on the state of Rhode Island to root out the corruption both inside and outside of our system. We need your support. You can visit my website at chas4ag.com to learn more about me, donate, or volunteer your time. I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I approve this message.
To take home the Golden Gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With me today is the Pulitzer-nominated journalist and author of multiple books, an expert on Afghanistan and Pakistan and the Middle East, Jere Van Dyke, and we'll be discussing his newest book, called Without Borders, the Haqqani Network and the Road to Kabul. For those of you interested, the book looks like this. You can find it on Amazon. But before we get to this very fascinating story, I'd like to start with a bit of a preamble for those who are new to Mr. Van Dyke's work, and to ask him about how he got involved in that region and what were the experiences that led to the first books which preceded this latest development.
Thank you, Irina. My experience in Afghanistan begins a very long time ago. When I was a young man, after I just gotten out of the army, going to graduate school in Paris, I called my parents in Washington State and asked if my younger brother could join me, and that I wanted to drive a car across Asia. This was before the black curtain of Islamic fundamentalism, if you will, descended upon Iran and the rest of Asia. And I wanted to, because at that time you could drive a car across Asia and you could sell it for a profit and then use that money to fly back. We were, of course, very young. And so my brother and I arrived in Afghanistan in the 1970s when women in the streets of Kabul could wear clothes like women in Europe, or dress like women in Europe and in America, and schoolgirls wore short skirts and knee socks and carried their books and laughed in their streets. It was a very completely different world from what it is today. So I fell in love with the romance and the, if you will, the wildness of Afghanistan. Therefore, I came back to Washington, D.C. I worked for Senator Henry Jackson of Washington State, where I grew up. And then I left there and arranged with the New York Times to return to Afghanistan. So in 1981, I hiked from what is today called the tribal areas of Pakistan up into the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. And I lived with Jalaluddin Haqqani, his younger teenage brother, Ibrahim, and 16 fellow tribesmen, total of 18 men. They called themselves the Haqqani Mujahideen. Mujahideen means holy warrior. And 5 years later, half of them were dead. Today, in my view, the Haqqani Network, as it is called by the United States and its allies, is the most powerful jihadist group in the world. So my book is a story of that time and that movement, actually, that started centuries before, but I use one family, in this case, the Haqqanis, to tell the story of where we are today and how we got there. But after living with the Haqqanis, I moved south, worked my way south to the Kandahar region, was desert, which was flat, and that was actually more dangerous than being with the Haqqanis, because it was trench warfare, and Soviet Union came in with tanks, and I finally made my way out by camel, rifle in the camel, with my Mujahideen escorts to Pakistan, made my way to India, and there I wrote my dispatches for the New York Times, and then later wrote a magazine story about my time, Sunday New York Times magazine story about my time with Jalaluddin and his men and the other Mujahideen, and wrote other articles, and stayed involved in Afghanistan for a number of years, worked with Zalmay Khalilzad, and he was a professor at Columbia University at that time. And after that, he became closer to the Reagan administration, and he asked me if I would join him to create what became known as the what we called, I guess you will, Friends of Afghanistan. And it was an attempt, a successful attempt, to create a journalist entity for the Mujahideen, to take their articles, their video, and send them to the greater Arab Middle East. So what the United States was doing was trying to show its sometime ally and a lot of enemies, because the Soviet Union by then was very influential in the Middle East, particularly in Egypt, which it had an alliance there. And so it was an attempt to undermine the Soviet Union in the Middle East. And then I wrote my first book called In Afghanistan, which came out in the 1980s. And then when 9/11 occurred, CBS News hired me the next day, and I became a radio person and then eventually a television commentator and analyst for CBS. And I returned to Afghanistan in December 1981, in 2001. And so I was with CBS for a period of up until 2017, during which time, in 2006, I had a contract with the U.S. Army War College to write a monograph, academic paper, if you will, on the history, rise, and present state of what we in the West call Islamic fundamentalism in South Asia, which is Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Kashmir. And I finished that. And upon finishing that, I'd gone up, while finishing that, I'd gone up into the mountains to look into the story of the death of the American football star and soldier Pat Tillman, because I didn't really believe everything I was reading, and I wanted to go to where he was killed to see if I might possibly write about this. And while doing this, I realized that there was a part of me that wanted to return to that life that I had led as a very young man up in the mountains. And while doing all of this, I got a call from the New York Times book division asking if I could return to the tribal areas of Pakistan where I had spent time in the 1980s. And the editor was very blunt. He said, the CIA does not know where it appears bin Laden is hiding. You know the tribal areas along the border where supposedly he, as well as Ayman al-Zawahiri and others who were prominent in Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, escaped after 9/11, or after the US invasion in October, beginning in October 2001. And I thought maybe there is finally a chance for me to meet up with the Akanis again. And that had been on my mind ever since I returned to Afghanistan in 2001. I met with Yunus Khalis, who was the political leader, if you will, of what is today the Akani Network, when Akani worked and fought under his umbrella, if you will, in Eastern Afghanistan. And I met with other Mujahideen, former Mujahideen, but I never was able to get to the Akanis. And so I saw this as an opportunity to do that. And I lived in the mountains, grew a beard, let my hair grow long, tried to live as I had before. I crossed the border illegally 4 times into Afghanistan, and the last time, always meeting with the Taliban. The Taliban always kept their word until they didn't. And then I became, in February, it was February 2008, I was kidnapped by the Taliban. And was the first American journalist kidnapped in Pakistan, if you will. It was in the mountains in Pakistan, after Daniel Pearl. And a great many people, friends, as well as local Afghans and US military and CIA and others, did all that they could to prevent, I was told later in the exact words of one man, a second Daniel Pearl. Obviously, and unfortunately, I was released. And that led to my second book on Afghanistan called Captive. And then I wanted to cease being a victim, if you will, a kidnapped victim. CBS said I could no longer travel east of Turkey. And I thought of finding a way to, one, cease being a victim, always being seen as that, it's a form of weakness, and to do what I had done with the Army War College in South Asia, in the Middle East, where I did not have the credentials, I did not have a background, I didn't understand the language or the culture beyond just casual visits now and then, and combine the two into a book. And I got a contract from the War College, and I also got a contract from a conservative national security policy foundation. And they asked me not to ever use their name. They gave me the contract. And then I went to a publisher, and I got a book contract. And then in 2013, I embarked upon this project. I started in Yemen, where I went to, it turns out it was a Muslim Brotherhood school in Sana'a, to learn Arabic, or at least the basics of Arabic as much as I could. And then from there, it was a month in Egypt, and then 2 months in Saudi Arabia, and then time in Sudan, Bahrain, where I had lunch with my old fellow Afghan hand, Jamil Khashoggi. And I write about this in this new book, a side of him that people don't know, and things that he told me, and advice that he gave me, and which I followed, and becomes an important part of the book, and it tells you a lot about him. And so I finally, after many years of going back and forth, because at the same time, while working on this book, part of the contract stipulated that I was to find the reach of the Akani network in the greater Middle East. That was what was asked of me. And so while doing that, realized and I was doing this alone. CBS would not allow me to use their name in any way, even though I still work for them. But I had a letter of introduction from the Council on Foreign Relations, very establishment, of course, here in New York. But it was, to be honest, it was risky because I was meeting with jihadists, and my credential then, and to a degree still today, is that I'm the only person around still who is working, who lived with the Mujahideen during the time of the Soviet invasion when their backs were against the wall. And I am not seen, therefore, in the eyes of jihadists as an imperialist journalist from the West, because I was with them at the beginning. They're fighting the atheist communist, if you will. And so that enabled me to at least knock on a door and eventually open some doors in the jihadist world in the Middle East. But it was also very, very risky, particularly in Saudi Arabia. And so I was warned more than once to be very careful. What I was doing was dangerous. But I also realized that I had to try to find the Akanis, again, to finally figure out by talking to them what the reach was in the Middle East, because without really getting word from them, everything I was doing would be based on hearsay or what jihadists told me. They weren't lying, but it was just very difficult. And at the same time, ISIS rose. And when ISIS rose, that, of course, made it far more difficult. But it was when watching the execution on television of Jim Foley and of Stephen Sotlov, the American freelance journalists who were killed by ISIS, I said, I have to go back to Afghanistan. And so I did that, because also deep in my mind, I never quite believed what everyone told me about my kidnapping. It was just so different from everybody else's. Money was a factor, absolutely. And they wanted 3 men from Guantanamo and $1.5 million to release me. But there were other things that played into it that I didn't quite understand, that I wanted to figure out who really kidnapped me and why. And so this led to, while the horror of the executions of these Americans and British and Japanese journalists and aid workers on television by ISIS horrified the world, and particularly the Americans, those tragedies horrified Americans. That led to a great interest in kidnapping. So my agent and editor asked me to put my book aside and to write what became The Trade, my journey into the labyrinth of political kidnapping. And that came out in 2017. The Sunday New York Times Book Review picked it as an editor's choice, and was very, very favorable to me, very honest, favorable to me in its review, and that helped considerably. So that would be the next book. And so finally, I was able to, in 2015, through tribal leaders I knew in Afghanistan, and by circuitous routes, and through people I've known for up to 40 years now, who trust me, and I will never betray them, I was able to began to meet with the Akanis again in 2015. And out of which came this book, as well as the stories of my time with their allies, their enemies, and the jihadist networks to the degree that I could find them. And finally, I found what the true power is in the Middle East today by an interview I had with an ISIS leader on the Syrian-Turkish border in 2017. And so that book, which is just now coming up, called, as Irina showed you very kindly on the screen here, the Akani, without borders, meaning it's not limited to Afghanistan, the Akani network and the road to Kabul.
I'll get back to the title of this a little bit later, because I'd like to discuss the geopolitical misunderstanding between Western powers and governments and this network. But before we get to that, I kind of want to go back in time and get to the point you were discussing about Pat Tillman, the fact that something in the circumstances of his end did not sit well with you, and that you wanted to investigate. Did you ever what was it that caused you to not believe the official story, and what did you discover at the end of, ultimately?
I'm sorry, Rena, I didn't quite catch all of that. It's regarding to what I
Pat
was told
Tillman.
about my kidnapping?
No. Before that, Pat Tillman. What initiated the chain of events was your investigation into the circumstances of Pat Tillman's demise, which you said you did not quite believe from the way it was described in the media.
I'm sorry, whose demise? The
Pat Tillman. Pat Tillman.
Pat Tillman. I'm sorry, forgive me. Thank you for asking that. That is a very, very important question. And that I'm working on that. I've written a lot now. Twice I've been to the canyon where he was killed. And I have, this is my next project, which I hope to finish within a year. To get to the point of your story, I, like everybody else in this country, followed to the degree that I could the story of Pat Tillman, and his younger brother Kevin, both of whom were athletes of significance. One more famous than the other. One, Pat played professional football. He gave it with the Arizona Cardinals. He gave all that up to enlist after 9/11. His younger brother was in the Cleveland Indians, today Cleveland Commanders, baseball farm team. Enlisted, went into Afghanistan, became enlisted into the army. Were posted first to the Middle East, and then in Iraq, and then later in 2004 to Afghanistan. And their they were Rangers, elite military force, as we know. And their orders, and this comes from a book written by one of their fellow soldiers. It came out in 2019, and the orders that they got, their regiment at Fort Lewis, was to look to capture or kill Osama bin Laden, and to degrade to the degree that you can. I don't know if it's to the degree that you can, but to degrade and try to harm as much as you can the Haqqani network. So they were in Jalaluddin Haqqani territory. Initially, the Haqqani network was blamed for what every newspaper article, every television program, every radio program we have all watched and read was a firefight. And that ultimately it came out after X number of congressional hearings that he was killed as a result of friendly fire. In 2006, which in part led to my trip there, I was sitting in the newsroom at CBS and reading front page of the New York Times, and there was an interview in the New York Times with Pat Tillman's father. And he was standing in San Jose, California, where he lives. And he was standing outside a house about 70 yards away. And he said, I could throw a rock at that house. And I can see that house as well as you can. And you're telling me that those soldiers couldn't see my son, clearly. And something clicked in me. I said, there's something wrong here. I don't trust this. I don't know what it is, but I don't believe everything I've read. And one reason was because in everything I read, it was always American soldiers said this, or officers said this, Pentagon said this, journalists said this. Not once did anybody make reference to a conversation or a question they might have asked any Afghan. I said the Afghans had to be there. Number one, I have a background in Afghanistan. Two, I ran track at the University of Oregon and on U.S. national teams afterwards. I understand the importance of and the power of, to a degree, an athlete in America. And I also have been in the military. And I feel an obligation. I wanted to look into this. I couldn't find anybody who would support me. I piggybacked off a 60 minutes trip to Afghanistan and went up into the canyon where Pat Tillman was killed. And what I found out, and which is crucial to the book, is that those Rangers were not alone. And what was the case is that the CIA, I think Blackwater was the organizer, if you will, or the instructor, according to one card that one of the soldiers said. They were traveling with Afghan soldiers the entire time. They're allied together. And those men, not unlike in American history when the army was moving west, and America was moving west and fighting the Sioux and the Arapaho and the Comanche and so forth. We would use American Indians, today we call Native Americans, as guides. And so it's not unlike that. But in this case, it was to go after bin Laden and so forth. And I interviewed every single one of them. And I have it all on camera, and their stories are completely different from everything you've read in the news. And that's all I'm going to say.
Well, while I'm certainly looking forward to the final result of your project, I'm curious because from our past conversations, this is not the first time you referenced cover-ups, attempts to censor your work, and generally the circumstances surrounding these important security incidents. And at one point, you even mentioned that your own past work before this book, the other books, have been censored by the publications, by the media. What do you believe that was on account of some U.S. government national security letter that these organizations received, or what's behind all this censorship and cover-ups and lack of transparency?
I can't speak for Tillman one. To me, I think it, his father, Mr. Tillman, and I went out to see him, and he gave me all the U.S. Army reports, heavily redacted. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was strange that the father of the man who was fallen, the most famous American soldier, was not allowed to read all the reports from the military himself. I thought that was, number one, completely unfair. But and the father's Mr. Tillman was extremely upset about obviously what happened to his son. So there's a great deal of cover up there. And as regards to my case, yes, the last book, The Trade, was yes, very much censored. But that also was in part because of the manner in which I was kidnapped. And see, I felt and still feel that because of my background, my long background in the area, and the number of contacts I have among people who would be even today America's enemies, who are allies once, the Mujahideen, the Haqqanis particularly, because I'm trying to find out the truth, that it was just better not. I had a lot of trouble, and it was almost going to be a lawsuit, and it's something that I still don't feel it's good for me to talk about.
Well, this is a censorship-free zone, so if anytime you feel that you need a space to share any information, I want to make clear that this is certainly the place to do that. I do find this strange attitude towards sources by the very people who use that information in particular ways sort of odd, because here we have various major publications who do not shy away from interviewing terrorists, from giving them platforms. We have Al Jazeera, where representatives of various groups have free platform, and Al Jazeera is most welcome in the United States, and all these people are given a space, and none of that is considered remotely controversial. Is there anything different, do you feel, about the situation that could have led to this very strange and duplicitous, I would say, attitude from certain directions?
What I feel and what I talk about and write about in this book, the new one, is that I do not believe that Al Qaeda was created in Afghanistan at the end of, or just in Afghanistan at the end of the first, at the end of the Mujahideen War in 1989, when bin Laden and his men came together and decided they would carry on their jihad in the Middle East in their own countries, if you will. There's a lot more to it than that. And I don't believe that ISIS came out of nowhere. I don't believe that Al-Qaeda, I'm repeating myself, I definitely don't believe that Al-Qaeda was formed solely by young men themselves. And I firmly believe that because of needs for petroleum, for various treaty arrangements, that a lot of people that I do not believe for 1 second that our full story has been told about everything that has transpired so horribly since 9/11, and which all came out of the Afghan-Soviet War of in the 1980s. And I write about this in the book. I do, and it's delicate for me, but everything that I write comes from the words of former what we call, or in the CIA calls, American journalists call, the government calls Afghan Arabs, those who we brought with our allies, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, all those governments in the Middle East that we have been allied with. We brought them to help the Mujahideen fight in the 1980s, out of which we all have thought came Al-Qaeda, and then the horror of 9/11 and all that's it's happened since then. Is that what they told me, what every single jihadist I met told me, is a completely different story. And in essence, that Al-Qaeda and how how the U.S. has been, U.S. government for its own national security reasons and for its own treaty reasons, we have maintained partnerships with people who have harmed Americans. And it's very, I'm an American. I was in the military. I'm pro-American as the next person. It's just that, and also I understand I understand the necessity, if you will, of not telling the truth. And there are people who can not tell the truth, and there are people who have a hard time not telling the truth. And so, and I realize I'm being vague here with you, but it's all, I've written everything in that book, and it's delicate.
May I ask something specific? It may or may not be in the book, but I'm going to ask in reference to another piece of work on a related matter, the Looming Tower.
Right.
In the author describes at one point the efforts to convince Osama bin Laden while he was in Afghanistan to give up his lifestyle, to leave, to come back to Saudi Arabia. And this is the point where I felt that either the writer was leaving significant portions of his interviews with his subjects out, or the interviewees were not necessarily playing it straight with him, including members of the royal family in Saudi Arabia who were on the quest to convince Osama bin Laden to leave.
Right. There have been so many stories, haven't there been, on to what degree was the United States ever allied, perhaps, with bin Laden? I have no inside information on that. And I personally don't. I've heard many things when I was over there. I don't have any indication. I have no personal reason to believe that the U.S. was. But what I do believe, there's been a lot of, among those of us who followed this subject, it's been, well, he was working for Saudi Arabia here, or he was trained by Abdullah Azam, for example. But what I found in Yemen, that his mentor was somebody completely different. and his mentor is alive today. He's Yemeni, and he's older, of course, considerably older. And I believe since the invasion, since the UAE Saudi invasion of Yemen in 2015, that he has, I'm told, he's fled. And he's now in hiding in Saudi Arabia. So, and when you look at his story, this man's story, named Zindani, that's all I will say. But when you look into his story, it's clear that he was not just close to bin Laden, but close to Saudi Arabia at the beginning, which is not really illegal and not bad. That's just how things were. But where it becomes difficult is when you listen to all the Yemenis tell you that he's America's man. He's always been America's man. Now that you can see that's conspiracy theories. But the point they're trying to make is that so much of what we know, or we feel we know, is if you really go and talk to people on the ground, jihadists who were in Afghanistan during the 80s, who worked with bin Laden, don't mean they were going to tell me everything. Absolutely not. And they're going to, number one, I remember one particular fellow who wouldn't talk to me about Haqqani because he felt that I was probably some CIA agent or was going to not just harm him, but put the economies in jeopardy. So they're very, very protective of one another, that this community still very much exists. Interesting, one of the oldest, the longest serving, if serving is the correct word, prisoner in Guantanamo is a man who was he was a colonel in the Yemeni security forces. He was a businessman. He was very, very successful, very well thought of. And he was charged by the Yemeni government after 9/11 to find the 3,000, to find a way to take up to 3,000 men, former Afghan Americans, Afghan Arabs, and find them. And or to not find them, but to send them away from Yemen. And those men disappeared. And the U.S. captured him in a sting operation in Cairo. Oh, I'd say about 2000. I don't know, I'm just going to make it up. 2006, give or take. And according to all the stories that I read and everything I heard and everything I was told by his brother, in particular, that I'm not, and maybe they all lied, but I don't believe so. That he is still there today, and he's been offered money. He's been offered a great many things, according to his brother, if he will only give up those names. He refuses to do it. So he has been languishing in Guantanamo for up to 20 years now because he refuses to give up the names of those 3,000 fellow jihadists that he was supposed to send out to various parts of Africa to protect them, to save them from being captured by the US, I believe. So what I'm trying to say is that this network, this brotherhood, this sense of camaraderie that began in the 1980s surrounding Jalaluddin Haqqani and others, among the Mujahideen and later among the Taliban, exists today very much throughout the world.
Would it be fair?
And I don't think it's dangerous. It really is. Yeah.
Would it be fair to say that those 3,000 jihadis, probably whoever is still alive, might still be operational in wherever they're currently located?
Of course. Or if not operational, they're certainly not. Well, maybe they all got married and settled down. If they're 65 years old or so, that fire may not still be there. But the point is that he refused to give them up. He has given up his life, in effect. It appears. I don't know how long he's going to languish there to protect them. And who knows what they have done or where they are today. You're exactly right to suppose that. I don't have any inside information on that.
Another factor that you've pointed to in some of your writing, and that I feel has not been sufficiently discussed, dealt with by the international community, and really not been addressed very far, is the Pakistani intelligence role in all of this, and in facilitating some of the most radical mujahideen. To this day, the US does not really discuss very much that complicated relationship or where the situation stands now. The last I heard about this organization is that one of them had partnered with an IRGC member to infiltrate the US Secret Service, and that was and then made an escape under bizarre circumstances. All of that, to me, suggests that for whatever reason the US has not been able to come to grips with the fact that ISI had its own agenda, and it was not necessarily a pro-US agenda this entire time.
I know you've hit the nail on the head. You went right to a very, very delicate subject. And an anecdote, firstly, on this. When I just began to travel across the border into the tribal areas, was at the same time that if you and anyone listening or anyone who would ultimately see this remembers the news every night on the news, we would somehow learn that the Pakistani army had X thousand men, maybe 100,000 men, looking for bin Laden along the tribal areas or in the tribal areas. You hear all of this. And I was traveling all through the tribal areas, and I never once saw a Pakistani military official anywhere. Number two, and that was the information they were getting from the government. And I would talk about this and no one would want to touch it, but it was so jarring, all that we were hearing the Pakistan army was doing. But when I was there, and I admit I was illegal, I was breaking the law, and I paid for it, and I continue to, in that, yeah, there are a lot of ripple effects. One of the main men who got me out said in a kidnapping, and there are, but that it was just so obvious that what we were being told and was told to us on television was to me not the case at all. What I mean, to go back, the reason, and you touch on a very, very important and delicate subject, and that is in 1954, the U.S. established a military alliance in order to surround and try and control and defeat Soviet Union, Soviet communism with Pakistan. And India didn't want any part of that. India had a strong, very powerful communist party at the time, had sort of an indirect alliance with Soviet Union. But Pakistan made the very clear decision to work with us. And so from 1954, that military alliance is held strong. And if you talk to, or you talk to any former American soldier who has served in Afghanistan, and he will tell you, that his feelings are towards Pakistan and the ISI are not unlike yours. I mean, what are we really doing there? Who are we really fighting? And so you would hear this from American soldiers. And I heard it very, very clearly when my guards were taking me up into, and I had to have guards, armed men. I had to pay for this when I was in where Pat Tillman was killed, because he was killed within 3 miles of the Pakistani border. And so that relationship exists very, very strongly between the ISI and the CIA, which began and blossomed, if you will. That's not really a good word, but grew because of a mutual goal, and that is to defeat Soviet communism and get the Russians out of Afghanistan. And today, for example, go to Saudi Arabia. We have a treaty with Saudi Arabia, as we all know, for President Roosevelt, all based upon his journey there after he came back from Yalta in 1944 with King Abdulaziz. that we will come to their aid, and we have this treaty agreement with Saudi Arabia. But if you talk to any Saudi official who pays attention to these matters, is maybe even involved or has been involved, we say our closest, most important relationship is with Pakistan. So the Pakistani-Saudi alliance is crucial. There are those who will tell you that it was Saudi Arabia who paid for or financed the Pakistani nuclear arsenal. There are those who tell you that if Saudi Arabia, if Iran develops a nuclear facility, a nuclear capability, that Saudi Arabia is going to use Pakistan's knowledge and Pakistan's nuclear facilities to create their own. I don't know the truth of that, but this is what I've heard this from both sides in Saudi Arabia and there. So that, when the United States, I felt, was walking a fine line in Pakistan, and I'm certainly not going to attempt to, sitting here in a chair, second guess some officer who's trying to protect his men and do his duty, or any soldier who's trying to do his duty, but that we have this alliance with Pakistan, and the goal was, of course, to find bin Laden, to get rid of Al Qaeda. I'm not convinced the goal in any way was to try and destroy the Taliban. That was a different thing entirely, and that is not just Jere talking. That is a lot of things I would hear myself. So America has, like any great power, larger geopolitical concerns than those of us who don't have to worry about that. And I was alluding to that at the beginning of this when I talked about America's ties to kings, dictatorships, and they're just recently, we've all seen the articles coming out that a great number of American soldiers have gone and worked for, very quietly, after they retired, for the UAE and maybe even Saudi Arabia, for the money. And I'm not going to criticize that. I mean, that's just something that was kept secret that's come out. But the point is that the U.S. alliance with Pakistan, even though it's going through a lot of changes, and Russia is doing all it can to make inroads in Afghanistan. It's back in Afghanistan today against the U.S. alliance with Pakistan by supplying them with, or trying to sell oil and wheat to them now after the tragedy of the floods in Pakistan, and of course Putin's need to find new markets because of the trouble he's having selling his oil. So that alliance is very, very, very awkward, and only the deepest echelons of America, deepest parts of America understand what is really going on today. But the Pakistani military alliance holds true, and I think that was definitely a factor in the difficulties that the United States had in really waging what Afghans will tell you they sometimes call a lipstick war, putting a pretty face on an ugly reality, or even a jewelry war, that we were really not fighting the war that we said we were doing. And those are phrases that come directly from Afghans, not from Jere, not from me.
To the extent that we weren't possibly fighting the war we were claiming, did we succeed with the real objectives or whatever we were in fact fighting?
No, I didn't. I did not. One reason I went back to look into my kidnapping was because one day my main jailer just sort of casually said that the political officer was here. Now, when I got home after my kidnapping, not once did any American official, nor since, not that I deal with them, anybody necessarily today, has ever mentioned political officer, ever said those two words. And in many years later, when I was doing this research, I asked an ex-FBI man I know. I met a lot of FBI, because the FBI, not the CIA, is in charge of all Americans kidnapped abroad. It's an extension of how they're in charge of kidnappings in America and now of Americans overseas. And I've worked with them, and they've always been so very, very kind and helpful to me. And I asked for contacts in the UK. So they gave me, one man gave me the name of two men, and I met with them in a pub. And the first, because of the subject, something I was looking into, and they wanted to know about my kidnapping. And the first question they asked me was, well, what about the political officer? These are British. I mean, the British created this term, the political officer. And not one American official ever mentioned that name to me. I don't know if, I won't say they don't know about it, or maybe it's a her now, but a political officer is something that the British created in the tribal areas of Pakistan when Pakistan was still part of India. And as anybody will tell you, anybody who really knows Pakistan, or anybody who really knows Afghanistan, I mean, Afghans or Pakistanis or Indians, the political officer knows, and this is a quote from every Pakistani of any stature that you will meet, knows everything that happens in his domain, in his tribal area. And so the fact that my main jailer just casually or on purpose, or should he not have said it, just said the political officer who was here. So that meant that the Pakistani government knew I was in that prison somewhere up in that mountain. So was I kidnapped for a particular reason by the government? In other words, the government and the Taliban are one and the same.
Now, it's funny because consequently, the Pakistani government claimed that the Afghani Taliban is a threat to Pakistan's national security. And while there are certainly tribal and intertribal spats that I can very easily imagine, this really raises question, how much of a difference is there between the Afghan Taliban, the Pakistani groups affiliated with the Taliban, the Haqqani network, and various other groups related to that. That became a significant question last year when when a certain line by a particular group of voices claimed that Haqqani and the Taliban and all these other people were completely separate entities and had nothing at all in common.
Once again, you've gone right to the heart of things. Yeah, there are two sides to this. Number one, the Pakistani army has, and the people, especially the people, have suffered. The Pakistani army has lost a number of people to the Taliban, and there are two types of Taliban. One they call TTP, which is those who they told me, the people who had me said they were TTP. TTP is Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, which just means the Pakistan Taliban movement. There is also the Afghan Taliban. Now, there's not a single, and the Taliban are by and large Pashtuns, the largest ethnic group in Pakistan. Yeah, Pashtuns, the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan and in Western Pakistan. You will never meet a Pashtun who accepts the present frontier border, if you will, called the Durand Line by the British and later by the Americans, which is today has been fenced. There's a cyclone fence along the border. There's not one Pashtun who accepts that border. If you talk to any Pashtun, for them, Afghanistan ends at the Indus River, which is 90 miles deep inside Pakistan. So what you have is two different elements whose ultimate goals will be the same, and that is to take back their land, because they're all Pashtuns. And what Pakistan has done is, because it certainly cannot move east into India, and for what the term, and I'm sure you've heard this, and many people have heard this over the years, what they call security, deep security, or there's another term. So if the Pakistan military in a war with India is pushed back, it can move into Afghanistan. Its goal has always been and this comes from, and this, I write this in this book, and this is verbatim from President Karzai's national security advisor and later foreign minister, today in exile in Germany. His exact words, and this is the truth, is that Pakistan's goal has long been to, because it cannot move east, is to recreate the Mughal Empire and to trade with Sunni Central Asia. So, which has been one reason why they have backed the Taliban as their proxy army, in the same way that they backed, to a degree slightly different, but similar to backing the Mujahideen, in order to create their own depth in Afghanistan and to control Afghanistan, and to move north across the Amudari River into Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and all these other Sunni Central Asian states, and create the Mughal Empire, or recreate the Mughal Empire, which the British destroyed finally in 1847, or no, excuse me, long before, when they 1805, I think, finally, when they began to move into India, which was then ruled by the Mughal Empire. Therefore, Pakistan's goal is to use the Taliban at the same time the Taliban are fight. Certainly, as and I write this in the book, a member of the Taliban Military Council in exile in Dubai told me in 2017, in a meeting in a hotel there that I had with him, arranged by an Afghan for me, that no, they don't have any love for Pakistan. Pakistan treats them like a dog. That's a quote. But they need Pakistan in the same way that, where else can they go? They say, we don't like India with all their strange gods. We don't trust China. They're communists. They don't believe in God. We feel close to Al Qaeda, but we really want to be close to America because they are believers. Now, you could say that this is political commentary on his part, but I think there's an element of truth there. Most definitely that they have an alliance with Pakistan, but they certainly don't feel close to Pakistan. And I will tell you, and I write about this, but I will tell you, and I don't think, that the Akhanis, and every time I met with the Akhanis, I met with them in Pakistan. And this was done secretly, but the ISI knew I was there, without a doubt. And there was always an ISI officer present, or some people. I just knew it. And once I had to be vetted here at the Pakistani consulate in New York by the ambassador, and it was indirect, of course, but I was told I would have to be vetted before I go. So they understood my relationship with them, and so I'm sure that everybody knew what I was doing. And so the Akhanis, I remember once in particular, Ibrahim, trying not to show too much anger, but quite upset that the ISI came in and one day and I think took their passports and put pressure on them in some ways that it made it very clear to me that they were not happy there, and that they were under the thumb, if you will, of Pakistan. And more tragically, the main Khani network facilitator, the man who in charge is one of Sirajuddin's older brothers, Sirajuddin being the military commander of the Taliban, Sirajuddin Haqqani, today the interior minister of Afghanistan, and probably off the record, the deputy leader of the Taliban, I'm told, is that the man who was in charge, who set up the Islamic Emirate in his name is Nasruddin Haqqani, who set up the Islamic Emirate, I'm told, in Doha in Qatar. He was the main Haqqani fundraiser in the Middle East. One day, it was 2012, I believe, in Islamabad, he went to a bakery to, I don't know what the occasion was at the end of Ramadan, but for whatever reason, he went to this bakery near in Islamabad, where when he walked out the door, he was killed. He was murdered. He was shot to death. And as he lay there, a Jeep pulled up and took him away. And so I asked Ibrahim, who killed him? I asked other people, who killed him? Was it the CIA kill him? Did the Delta Force or kill him? Did Pakistan kill him? ISI kill him? Who killed him? And Ibrahim wouldn't answer me. He said, well, I don't know. I mean, he wouldn't tell me. But so I asked others. And the reason that he was killed, someone said, well, the US told Pakistan, that they've got to deal with Al Qaeda, and they've got to deal with the Taliban along the border, particularly in the Aqanis. You got to do something about them, and you got to put an end to this. And so they told Pakistan, they told the Aqanis, ISI told the Aqanis to move. And Nasruddin said, "This is our land. This has always been our land. You cannot tell us what to do." In other words, Nasruddin got a little ahead of himself, or showed too much pride, a bit of arrogance, perhaps, which resulted in his death. But the point I'm trying to make is the Aqanis were guests in Afghanistan. Pakistan killed the main Aqani fundraiser in the Middle East. That tells you very much who's in charge and what their goals are.
Going back to something you mentioned earlier, which was the oil interests in the region, one of the things that is particularly interesting to me in light of what you just said about the Mughal Empire, Central Asia, territorial disputes, and Pakistan's interest there, is the issue of the pipeline that the US government has supported for the past 30 years, and which has been a subject of dispute, political intrigue, attempted arrangements by assorted parties. What can you tell me about this? Why is US supporting, in theory, that project, given that the likelihood is, if it ever comes to pass, then it will take these actors one step closer to rebuilding that very empire that is, that could result in another huge war, invasion, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, the pipeline is something that they have wanted for many, you're right, for a very long time. And a number of American actors have been involved in this, of course. And as not too many people know, but it's a fact, just not long, I don't know, 1999, maybe, I'm not sure the exact date, but an oil consortium, which was headquartered, if you will, in Houston, in Texas, invited the Taliban to Houston, and the Taliban were guests of the oil companies in maybe oil, natural gas companies in Houston, for the purpose of doing business. And of course, everything changed after 9/11. But the point is that relationship existed, and that would have been that meeting or in that arrangement to bring the Taliban leaders to the United States would have to have gone through the government. And so everybody was, and in Pakistan, everybody had most, well, I won't say for sure in Pakistan, but would have to have been involved. And as a business arrangement, yes, the goal was to bring down oil, natural gas from Central Asia into Pakistan, or maybe even directly to, across Balochistan to the Arabian Sea. And then, of course, everything changed after the war. And today, because of Ukraine, I have no inside information on that. I do know that the Chinese, of course, and everybody knows this, been working hard on, and I think have a direct pipeline now to Iran. So I'm sure things are going on. Perhaps if I were Pakistan, I would work with China, its closest ally, to try and come up with something. Will they be able to cross Afghanistan with the Taliban in power is something that I don't think Pakistan can control, or anybody can control. And so your question is, at one point, would certainly have been very important, and still of great interest to me. I think you're certainly right to bring it up and to make us all aware of it, but I just don't think it's a factor right now. Their big problem is trying to, they export coal, and the coal's being dug in primitive ways almost, and it's by truck to Pakistan, China wants to has its eyes on various natural resources, earth metals, etc. But it's hard to make arrangements with the Taliban because for security reasons, and the Chinese workers are getting killed. So that entire situation at the moment, I think, is very precarious, and there's really nothing that the U.S. can. It doesn't appear that the U.S. is really making much headway or trying to. I don't really know. I can't say that. I don't know what it's trying to do, but I do know that that the Taliban want to work with the United States, so they would try to do something. But more than anything, right now, you have Vladimir Putin on September 27th cutting a deal with the Taliban to sell them oil or petroleum, gasoline, maybe natural gas, wheat, and those truck convoys that would come down from what was once Soviet Central Asia, cross the border, gone through the Salang Pass and the Hindu Kush Mountains, built by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, delivered that oil to the Taliban. Putin has met with the Taliban. He has said that we have to do business with them. I think he's doing it for two reasons. One, to undermine the United States as much as he can. Three reasons. One, to undermine the United States as much as he can. Russia is now back in Afghanistan. For a long time, Russia has been financing certain Afghan leaders. They have apartments in Moscow. Equally, he has to find markets for his oil because of Ukraine. And so those two factors, to try to undermine America, to try in Afghanistan, as well as to sell his own oil. The Russians are very much there, and I think that that's going to. And Iran may or may not be able to. I know Saudi Arabia is there. Qatar is there. Qatar handles all American interests in Afghanistan, just as Switzerland handles all American affairs in Iran. So that relationship is there also. And they, of course, Qatar sits on the largest pool of natural gas in the world. So maybe the Taliban or Pakistan will be able to work out something there through the United States. I have no inside information on that, but the pipeline problem, which you correctly made reference to, I don't think is going to be a factor right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, that certainly makes sense, and yet one wonders, with all these actors and all that untapped wealth, what is the direction that's going to play, especially if the energy crisis keeps getting worse, as it seems to be.
Well, in Afghanistan, is that what you mean?
Oh, well, global energy crisis.
Oh my goodness. Yes, of course. The principal problem, the most interesting one, is the relationship America has with Saudi Arabia, and now Saudi Arabia making contact or working with, or perhaps initiated by Putin, to try and, of course, undermine or work against U.S. interests in there is a huge factor. We've been trying to use the term in Obama administration, pivot away from the Middle East to focus entirely on China. Today, we are all focused correctly on Ukraine, but equally, the problem with oil and our need for natural gas is as capable as American entrepreneurs are, with all their various fracking, which is so controversial, is that the largest pool of natural gas is in Doha, and you have all the oil that's in Saudi Arabia, and so those areas are going to become ever more important. And I think that for our fears is that I do not believe for one second that the ISIS, that Al Qaeda, who by the way are very, very much back in Afghanistan, and they could not come in on their own. Just ipso facto, I'm going to go to Afghanistan, but how that part of the world is still going to be very, very much a part of American interests. And to touch on a point, again, this is, and this doesn't deal directly with the economies. I have no really insight info. I haven't talked to them about this. But I do know that, and this goes back to some of your earlier important questions, is that when just after the U.S. killed Ayman al-Zawahiri, a prominent tribal leader in exile now, not in the U.S., elsewhere, who I worked with not him directly, but part of his family to help me with the economies, to make that introduction. Which, by the way, just as a small thing, that Pakistan, well, I want to finish this and I'm going to come back to something else, is that he told me that al-Zawahiri was moved from Pakistan after, the Taliban told him that al-Zawahiri was moved from Pakistan after bin Laden was killed, closer to and into his tribal territory, which is on both sides of the Afghan-Pakistani border. And he told me that the al-Zawahiri moved into Afghanistan in 2014. Was he lying to me? I don't know. I can't prove that. But the Taliban told him, meaning it was on his land, don't you say anything about it. And so he has to maintain a relationship with them. So it is entirely plausible that Pakistan had something to do with his moving. I don't believe, and I don't think there are too many people who believe that bin Laden, living so close to the Pakistani West Point, was there without the knowledge of Pakistan. Therefore, I don't believe that al-Zawahiri could be moved from Pakistan across the border into Afghanistan without Pakistan's knowledge, which just tells you so much that goes on beneath the surface, and of their ties there, and of their close ties to Saudi Arabia. So that all comes into one very dangerous mix, but it's something with which the U.S. is going to have to still, as it has for years now, confront.
Interestingly, I was actually going to raise the point about Zawahiri and the circumstances of his death, which to me, I found extremely convenient given the sheer number of assorted other Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K fighters who somehow dodged the bullet. Was his death in any way really important, whether for Al-Qaeda or for the US or for the region in general? And what happened after? I mean, okay, he was killed. Supposedly, the next leader appointed is based from Iran, and you still have other Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K operatives in the vicinity, and there's nothing to be done about them, and they're probably more lethal and more active than Zawahiri in his old age. So, what do you make of this very strange incident, and was he given over to the U.S. to placate them in some way, and in exchange for what, if that was the case?
I assume the man in Iran, referring to Saif al-Adel, yes, everybody says that he is the future leader of Al-Qaeda. I have no inside information on that, but you know what I was told, and I can't prove this. I was told that bin Laden has another son, and I was told this by an Afghan who actually was here. We brought him here. He was an important young man, and he's now he has a green card, but he's no longer here because of his family. He lives outside the U.S., and he told me that he knew absolutely that bin Laden's son had been in Afghanistan recently. And I don't have any inside information on that. But as regards to your question regarding al-Zawahiri, what I have been told, and this comes from a member of the Taliban inner circle. I will put it that way. And he is, when I was dealing with it, when I talked to Connies, I know that they cannot always for their own, this is when they're in Pakistan, for their own purpose, own reasons. And I certainly understand that and sympathetic to that. Tell me the truth. And so I said, I need somebody I can go to. And so I was through the whole Mujahideen network. There's somebody I use, and he is very much a member of the Taliban inner circle. And what he told me was that the US has been sending delegations to and meeting with Sirajuddin, as well as Ghani, as well as with Yaqub, who is Mullah Omar's son, and who is today the Minister of Defense. Minister of Defense, I don't believe he's ever fought in any war, but he is obviously symbolic. But there is clearly a lot that goes on beneath the surface that you and I don't know about. And to answer your question, yeah, if this tribal leader is telling me the truth, and the way he expressed it, that he was in this, the reason he first learned that there was somebody on his land who he didn't know about was when he was going near one area where there was a house and all these people were around this house, and he didn't know about that. And they said, and then it came out, and then the Taliban told him, and be careful. And the reason I say that is because in my experience, a tribal chief knows to the inch where his land begins and ends. And he knows everybody. He knows the number of families. And he also knows which son went to a madrasa and which son joined the army. And what Pakistan has been trying to do, and there's a fellow named a professor at Harvard, Steve Wald, I'd never met, who's done some writing on this too. I don't want it to just come from me, because he's written about this. And I write about this in the book. Definitely, the Pakistan has mounted an assassination program against tribal leaders of Afghanistan, of the Pashtuns on both sides. And when I was the last there, it was up to 1,500 that they'd already killed tribal leaders in order to recreate with a new form of the Ummah, the Muslim community. When I was in prison, the Taliban told me once they were very happy that one of their members had killed his own brother, his own blood brother, because his brother would not join them. And he chose the Taliban, meaning the Ummah that Pakistan is creating, to destroy the tribal structure of Pakistan in order to further its goal of controlling Afghanistan and former Soviet Central Asia. But that this man chose the Taliban, his new family, against his last one. So that again shows you the power of Pakistan. And the fact is that al-Zawahiri could not have done any of this on his own, and that the Taliban did protect him, but even that this tribal chief kept it secret from 2014. Maybe he told somebody in the US government, I don't know. But he told me, he called me, and he told, or it was first of all, he sent me a text, and then we talked on the phone. So that's just one small story to amplify what you were saying so much about what goes on behind the scenes. And it's hard I don't take just his word. I would have to ask a few other people to really establish this, because he would tell me that, that the US is meeting with Yaqub, he's meeting with the US is having secret meetings with Haqqani. You can't just trust one tribal leader. But as we all know, as the US was exiting, unfortunately, on television, and so tragically, from Afghanistan, that the head of the CIA flew to Afghanistan and met with somebody. And the man that I talked to, the man who's part of the inner circle, confirmed that that absolutely was the case, and the Taliban were happy to meet with it.
If I were conspiratorial minded, which I don't claim to be, but if I were, I would have said that perhaps Zawahiri's death was a reward for US withdrawal under the circumstances that they did, and not including the release of prisoners, the abandonment of the base, the abandonment of massive quantities of weapons, and so forth. But of course, I don't harbor such illusions that something like that could possibly happen.
If you talk to, in Yemen, I talked to a man named Tariq Al-Fadli, who established what the US and its allies later called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It's bin Laden's closest friend. Their fathers were friends. And he said, public enemy number one for the Mujahideen. He holds on to that word. He's older. Obviously, he's not part of the Taliban, but they look up to him. They know him because of his very, very close ties to bin Laden. Is that he said public enemy number one for every Mujahideen, for every jihadist, for every Taliban leader is Saudi Arabia. And Ayman al-Zawahiri was no friend of Saudi Arabia's.
Interesting. I want to come back to a couple of points made at the very beginning of this discussion. The first about the title of the book, and the second about your comment that the Haqqani network is the most dangerous jihadist network in the world. So first for the title. After leaving Afghanistan, US and many others inside and outside the country seem to have come to believe that what happens in Afghanistan stays in Afghanistan, that US could not continue staying there indefinitely, and just as bad as it is, that's just how it is, and well, let's focus on other problems. Apparently, the various and assorted jihadis, including the Haqqani network, don't view territorial territories the same way. They certainly don't necessarily look at states, nation states, the same way as Americans and others do. How do you think this is? Do you think this difference in understanding and vision of the future going to come back to haunt all of us at some point in the future?
Yeah, interesting question. I didn't choose the title, but it's appropriate in one sense that the jihadist movement is not certainly confined to Afghanistan. The center, is the British, the famous British historian Arnold Toynbee called Afghanistan the roundabout of Asia, and the last British viceroy of India called Pakistan the cockpit of Asia. And I believe that it remains so today. And the point of that article, and that was part of really my assignment from the foundation that funded me initially, was to look at these networks, to look at the influence, to look at what started in Afghanistan and how it is now certainly far, far away from Afghanistan. And if you talk, and the reason is that, and I'll come to to sort of round up, I realize I've been on here a long time, and I don't want to keep you much longer, but the power of economies, I'll come to that in a second, but the Mujahideen and now the Taliban are revered in the Arab Middle East because they are fighting the jihad that none of those aristocrats, none of those wealthy folks are doing, and believe that it's a part of their requirement, that if you have an imperialist or you have an invader on Muslim land, and you must kill those people, move those people off your land. And the Haqqanis have been at at the forefront, particularly Jalaluddin, with his brother Ibrahim from the beginning. They are a separate front from the Taliban. That's a quote from Ibrahim. We are a separate front. The Mujahideen started on their own. The Taliban on their own. The Afghanis were always separate from them. But the fact that they fought for so long and defeated the greatest in their minds, the greatest empires of the time, first the Soviet Union and America, they are revered throughout the greater Arab Middle East. And in great part because they have done what other men have not done, and therefore they have shown that they are real men. They are superior to others. And this is enormously important. Now, the Afghanis are at the absolute pinnacle of that because they are the oldest group that is still intact, that they began in the early 1970s on their own, the two brothers. And by the way, there were no madrasas in Afghanistan in the early 1970s, none at all. But they were very, very stalwart, opposed to this communist influence, urban, it's primarily urban, got into their area. And they began, I detail this in the book, and how they began to wage not physical war, but a political war against communism. And that they have kept at this, and they have grown through Pakistan, which introduced them and other Mujahideen leaders to Saudi Arabia, where they got passports like other Mujahideen leaders, and were able to fundraise in Saudi Arabia and certainly elsewhere in the Middle East. So this is where this border began to fade away, is in those early days. And it was Pakistan that facilitated that. To what degree did the United States know? Yeah, I talk about this in the book. So, and I certainly do not have any inside knowledge on a great many things, of course. But I can just tell you what I do know and what Ibrahim has told me, and I say Ibrahim because Jalaluddin, by the time we met, Jalaluddin had a stroke. He couldn't talk, and for whatever reasons, and I was upset, and I got upset at Ibrahim about this. He wouldn't let me see him again because I wanted to talk to find out things. And so the whole point is that what started as a very small group and what started as a anti-Russian, anti-Soviet jihad among men with help from Pakistan, and I go into detail how that started from the words of a Pakistani military officer, and I use various Afghans to corroborate that. And they are today still in power. And so why, to get to the point of your question, are they the most powerful, in my view, jihadist group in the world? Well, the bin Laden family is pretty much destroyed. Saif al-Adel is one man in Iran. I'm sure if you cross the border, a lot of people are probably going to know about it. But again, I'm talking in an area where I have no jurisdiction or no knowledge or credentials to talk about. But insofar as the Afghanis are concerned, they are backed by the Pakistani army. And the Pakistani army is the largest Muslim army in the world. And so with that backing, that very awkward relationship, if you will, because I've alluded to how difficult it was for them and who was under whose thumb in Pakistan, that their influence is so tremendous, and that one small example to answer your question is to tell you the story of, I had a meeting in 2017. It took a long time to arrange. I was nervous, with a ISIS commander along the Syrian-Turkish border. And I asked him about al-Baghdadi, the head of ISIS at the time, before he was killed, Ayman al-Zawahiri. I asked about him. I asked about a number of people, and he dismissed them. He said they are too interested in their own glory. They're too interested in themselves. They're too interested in power. And I said, what about, you ever heard of Jalaluddin Khan? He said, yes, Jalaluddin is different. Jalaluddin we respect. Here is a man who is probably 25 years old at the most, hardened fighter, picked one man who was not the leader of anything. And one reason why, and this is in one way the essence of the book, it's how could Haqqani, Jalaluddin, in this case, rise, and under his name, this one family becomes so incredibly important that the U.S. would move them to this, or pick them and use their name on, and we have heads of the Joint Chiefs of Staff talking about them before Senate Armed Services Committee hearings and so forth. And that today, it was the Haqqani network's militia that took Kabul, not the Taliban. The Taliban came after it. And he said, and the reason is, and this goes back to the heart of Islam, that fundamentally this is, in my view, a religious conflict, a religious war, is that Jalaluddin was asked many times to become the leader of the Taliban, to even become president. And he always turned it down. He would never allow himself to become the political leader. And I use a quote from Plato at the beginning of the book to describe that, in essence, by saying, this is to quote indirectly, I suppose, Plato here, is that he who wants to be leader does not deserve to be leader. And for Jalaluddin, and the same would apply, if you will, and I don't want to upset any Christian in America, that when Constantine, the first Roman who became emperor, who converted to Christianity, refused to become a Christian because to be a Christian was impossible. It was impossible to be a Christian and engage in politics. And so he was not a Christian until on his deathbed. He did not formally do that, become a Christian. And the same applies in a similar way with Haqqani, that he refused all power, and that to be a true Muslim was not to seek power, was not to, purely simple, to seek power, but to live as the Quran told you to live. And to fight jihad, of course, is certainly in Islam legitimate according to the Quran. And that this 25-year-old fellow, 10,000 miles away or 5,000 miles away from Afghanistan, recognized and chose Haqqani over every single Arab commander of power, al-Zawahiri, bin Laden was no longer a factor, al-Baghdadi, shows the incredible and remarkable and very interesting power of the Haqqanis today.
That also shows me that a lot of the counterterrorism analysts, extremist analysts, and regional specialists are not looking where perhaps they should be.
There you go.
Well, this was a very provocative and very interesting and paradigm shifting, at least for me, conversation.
Thank you.
And I certainly look forward to reading all of your work, and actually going back to your previous work in Afghanistan and looking at the roots of all of this. And I recommend and encourage everyone who wants to get a good understanding of the problems we are seeing today to go through all of this very carefully, because a lot of the most interesting insights are not found on the front pages of the newspapers, but in the works of people like Mr. Van Dyke, who dedicated their life to really understanding all of this from the ground up, completely, and clearly leaving no stone unturned.
Thank you, Irene, very much.
And for those of you who joined the program, we'll be back next Tuesday at the usual time, 9 p.m. With you was the Washington Outsider Editor-in-Chief, Irina Zuckerman. Thank you for joining. See you soon.
Bye-bye.